She never saw his face, not when he entered, not when he walked through her room like he belonged there, and not when he leaned over her as she dreamed. Sonja Larsson was already drifting between sleep and morning when the knife touched her skin. She didn't even scream. The first cut was that precise. August 24, 1990. Gainesville, Florida. A town built for college students, wrapped in oak trees and southern charm. The kind of place where summer feels like a slow exhale before real life begins. That week, thousands of students were returning to the University of Florida, moving into apartments, saying goodbye to their parents, and figuring out where the cheapest beer was. Sonja Larsson and Christina Powell had just moved into their new, off-campus apartment at Williamsburg Village. To freshmen, strangers at first, now friends, Sonja was studying education. She loved writing notes in colored pens, carried a journal with pressed flowers, and still called her mom every night. Christina, more reserved, had been nervous about moving out, but she smiled a little wider when Sonja was around. That night, they locked the doors, but the killer was already inside. He waited, watched, breathed with them. Then, sometime after midnight, he moved like a shadow through their space. He started upstairs. Sonja was in bed, still under the covers. The first stab sliced through her chest, clean and deep. She struggled, of course she did, but he was faster, stronger. When it was done, she was left draped in silence, blood soaking into her mattress. Downstairs, Christina had heard something. She wasn't asleep anymore. She got up, maybe thinking it was Sonja in the kitchen, but he was already behind her. He tied her up, raped her, stabbed her, then posed her body with surgical precision. He cleaned the scene, wiped the knife, covered mirrors with towels. He took her nipples with him, as a souvenir, as something else. And then, he left. The door was locked behind him. The next morning, Gainesville kept moving. Students bought books, coffee shops filled with sleepy chatter, professors updated syllabi. No one knew that, just a few blocks away, two girls were lying in their own blood, until another girl didn't show up to work. August 26th, Krista Hoyt. She worked part-time at the sheriff's office, lived alone, responsible, quiet, never late. When she missed a shift, a deputy was sent to check her house. He walked through the door expecting a scheduling error. What he found broke him. Krista had been attacked sometime in the early morning hours. Same mo, tape, knife, rape. But this time, the killer did something worse, something unspeakable. He decapitated her, then placed her head on a shelf, facing the corpse. So when the deputy stepped inside, he saw a body that was posed to look back at itself, one final, sick joke in a string of horrors that hadn't even fully begun. That night, Gainesville went still. Not quiet. Still. Like a town holding its breath. The police didn't make a public statement yet, but word spread fast. Rumors turned into warnings. Students started calling their parents. People moved couches in front of doors, slept with knives under pillows. The university issued vague safety notices. No one wanted to say the word out loud. Serial killer. But they didn't have a choice, because he wasn't done. After midnight on August 27th, the killer struck again. Apartment near Archer Road. Two students inside, Tracy Pauls and Manny Taboada. Manny was a football player, 6 feet tall to 100 pounds. He never stood a chance. The killer ambushed him first, stabbing him over 30 times before he could get out of bed. The noise woke Tracy. She ran, tried to lock herself in her room, that he got in anyway. Same pattern, rape, stabbing. Staging. He left her posed, the same way as the others, sprawled, exposed, displayed like she was the final scene in some private play. And then, nothing. No more bodies, no more screams. Just fear. 5 students for days. The city spiraled. Hardware stores ran out of locks. Guns flew off the shelves. People took turns sleeping so someone was always awake. The university set up 24-hour patrols. Gas stations became temporary motels. People stopped answering knocks at the door. There was no suspect, no motive, no witness. Just a phantom with a knife and a plan. Some said he was living in the woods. Others swore he was a professor. There were rumors of cults, satanic rituals, voodoo, all lies. But they made sense to people who were desperate for anything to explain the carnage. But evil doesn't need a reason. It just needs time. And he had taken his in total silence, total control, and without leaving a single fingerprint behind. The man now known as the Gainesville Ripper had turned an entire city into a crime scene. And what no one knew yet was that this wasn't his first act. This was the encore. Before Gainesville, before the photographs and courtrooms and yellow tape, there was a small house in Shreveport, Louisiana, and inside that house, there was a family 3 generations gathered for dinner. Tom Grissom was a gentleman, a grandfather. He'd worked hard all his life. His daughter Julie was 24, working full-time while raising her son. Sean was 8, obsessed with cartoons and peanut butter sandwiches. That night, they were supposed to eat, watch TV, and wind down like any other family. But Danny Rolling had already chosen them. He watched the house, waited. He didn't knock. He never did. He came through the back door. He brought a knife. What happened next was pure brutality masked in calm. He stabbed Tom first, fast and without hesitation. Then Julie. Her screams were muffled with tape. She was raped, then posed, nude and arranged in a sick display of ownership. Sean was the last. Drowned in the bathtub, no reason, no purpose. When police found the scene, they couldn't understand it. There was no clear motive, nothing stolen, no enemies. It looked staged, ritualistic, cold, but there were no suspects. The case went cold. Until Gainesville. No one had ever connected that night to anything larger. But for Danny Rolling, it was rehearsal. And to understand what kind of mind crafts murder like theater, you have to go further, back, to the beginning, to the childhood no one wanted to talk about. Danny was born in 1954. His father, James, was a Shreveport cop, a man trained to serve and protect, but at home, he served only pain. Danny was beaten as a toddler, told he was worthless, told that crying made him weak, told that he'd never be anything but a mistake. His mother tried to protect him, left several times, but she always came back, and the beatings always resumed. As a boy, Danny would stare into mirrors for hours, whispering to himself. He drew demons, made up stories, sang to the walls. He would disappear into the woods alone, sometimes for days. People said he was just quiet. He wasn't. He was rehearsing. By 16, he was an alcoholic. By 20, he was breaking into houses not to rob them, but to watch people sleep, to stand in the corners and feel invisible. Sometimes he'd take things. Sometimes he'd just leave messages. He was testing the space between fear and presence. He joined the Air Force, got discharged, got married, had a daughter, then pulled a gun on his wife. She left. His daughter disappeared from his life, and he unraveled fast. Danny became a drifter. He started sleeping in tents in the woods, shaving all his body hair, changing his name, talking to himself for hours, recording tapes, hours and hours of ramblings, stories about God and demons, about justice, about pain. He started calling the voice in his head Gemini. Gemini wasn't a character. It was a mask. He blamed it for everything he couldn't face in himself. Gemini liked knives. Gemini liked tape. Gemini liked silence and clean exits. Danny wasn't crazy. He was calculated. Between 1985 and 1990, he committed dozens of crimes across multiple states: burglary, assault, voyeurism, but no murder records, no rap sheets that showed what he really was. He was the kind of man who passed under radar like fog, who disappeared in daylight. And in November 1989, he stepped into the Grissom home. That was the night he crossed the line. That was the night he stopped pretending. 3 murders, 0 leads. Then Danny vanished again. Until Florida. Gainesville wasn't a last-minute detour. It wasn't chaos. He'd chosen it, studied it. He even scoped out the apartment complexes ahead of time. He knew which units were upstairs, which ones had back doors, which girls lived alone. He pitched a tent just outside campus, collected tools, duct tape, cleaning supplies, a screwdriver, a military-grade Kabar knife. He shaved himself clean again. No hair, no prints, no trace. And then, he waited. In the tapes later found in his camp, Danny called Gainesville his calling. He said Gemini was hungry. He said, "It's time." The first murder was Sonia, but she wasn't the first in his mind. Danny had already done this. He already knew how to cut, where to tape, how to move in and out like a ghost. But Gainesville gave him something new. An audience. He wanted them afraid. He wanted to be remembered. And as the students slept, as cops circled empty leads, as families drove through the night to pull their kids home, Danny was in the woods, sharpening his blade, singing softly. Waiting for the next scream. The city didn't sleep for the rest of August. Not really. It laid down. It closed its eyes, but it didn't sleep. In Gainesville, every creak of floorboards sounded like footsteps. Every flicker of light outside a window felt like eyes. Doors were barricaded. Showers were taken in groups. Some girls left town. Others taped butcher knives under their beds. 5 students were dead. The monster had a pattern, a ritual, and a message, but no face. And that was the most terrifying part. You could prepare for danger, but how do you prepare for a ghost? The police were running out of road. Every apartment complex in town felt like a trap waiting to be sprung. But they had nothing. No DNA match, no eyewitnesses, not even a clear timeline. The killer came and went like fog. He cleaned his crime scenes, taped over evidence, knew what he was doing. People started saying he was a cop, a professor, a student who snapped. But it was worse than that. He was no one, just a man who watched, and the only trace of him was a drop of blood. After the murder of Manny and Tracy, forensic teams discovered the killer had made one mistake, a small one, but enough. During the struggle with Manny, he'd nicked himself, left behind a few droplets. That blood was rushed into evidence, stored, cataloged, but it didn't match anything in the national database. The trail went cold again. Until a detective remembered something odd. A burglary. 1 week after the last Gainesville murder, a man had broken into a supermarket. Not a big case, just a petty theft. He came through the ceiling, stole some food, a cassette player, and walked out. He'd been caught the next day with camping gear, cash, and a small utility knife. The man had no ID, gave a fake name, claimed he was homeless. When pressed, he said he didn't remember anything. The arresting officers assumed he was mentally ill, charged him, booked him, and moved on. But they'd drawn blood, routine procedure. That blood was still on file. They tested it against the crime scene blood from the Ripper case. It matched. Suddenly, the phantom had a name, Danny Rowling. He'd been in custody the whole time, sitting in a jail cell in Marion County, only an hour away, quiet, invisible, not hiding, just waiting. And when investigators dug deeper, they found a storm waiting. Danny had no home address. He'd been living in a tent in the woods, just outside the University of Florida. Inside the camp, audio cassettes, a screwdriver, rope, stolen IDs, and one small, blood-stained note with the words Gemini Rising written in shaky ink. Then came the tapes. Dozens of them, hours of audio. Danny singing gospel, talking about God's justice, whispering to himself. He narrated scenes of fear and fantasy. Sometimes he cried, sometimes he laughed, but always, he returned to the murders. Not with regret, with pride. Danny had never planned to escape. He planned to be remembered. And still, even with the match, the evidence, the confession tapes, he said nothing when they brought him in for questioning. He looked up slowly, smiled, and began humming. He didn't need to talk. He wanted them to listen. Outside the prison, Gainesville tried to breathe again, tried to move on. But the damage was done. The apartments where the students died were now haunted in daylight. Students transferred. Families moved. Professors gave lectures to half-empty classrooms. The town had lost something that couldn't be rebuilt, its illusion of safety. And yet, something deeper lingered. Investigators weren't convinced Gainesville was the beginning, the posing, the control, the calm. It felt rehearsed. That's when they found the link to Shreveport. a retired detective in Louisiana, had read about the Florida murders. He couldn't shake the similarities to a cold case from 1989. The Grissoms, 3 dead, staged, silent. He called Florida. They compared crime scene photos, mutilation, tape, posing. It was the same man Danny Rolling had killed before. Gainesville wasn't the birth of a killer. It was the second act. Back in Florida, the media got wind of the story. They dubbed him the Gainesville Ripper. Cameras swarmed courthouses. Reporters camped outside crime scenes. Students gave interviews. Parents held each other on live television. The country had seen serial killers before, but not like this, not with such cold artistry. And Danny watched from behind glass, like a man who directed the whole thing. He didn't flinch, didn't blink. When asked if he had anything to say to the families, he quoted scripture. When asked why he did it, he looked up at the ceiling and whispered, Gemini. He wasn't hiding anymore, because he thought he was bigger than justice, bigger than death. But justice was coming, and this time, Danny wouldn't walk out the back door. The courtroom wasn't ready for him, not because they hadn't prepared, not because the evidence was weak. There was enough blood, enough DNA, enough screams buried in police reports to bury 100 men. But because Danny Rolling didn't enter like a man about to be punished, he entered like a man about to perform, handcuffed, calm, eyes steady, clean-shaven, almost polite. He looked like someone's quiet uncle, the kind who offers to help fix your screen door, then disappears into the background. That was the real horror. Danny Rolling didn't look like a killer. He looked ordinary. He looked forgettable. But what he said, that burned into people. He didn't plead guilty, not at first. He let the prosecution build the case, let them read every detail, every mutilation, every photograph shown on projection screens in full color. He sat there, listening to his own story told by strangers, and never flinched. The families, they sat frozen. Mothers holding scarves soaked with tears. Fathers with fists pressed into knees. A few couldn't even look at him. Because how do you look at the thing that ended your child's life and see a man instead of a monster? Then, one morning after months of silence, he spoke. Not in a press conference, not on the witness stand. He called for the courtroom to be seated, and he confessed, all of it. The murders of Sonia Larson, Christina Powell, Krista Hoyt, Manny Taboada, Tracy Pauls, and the Grissoms in Louisiana. He didn't stumble, didn't pause. He named each victim, described what they were wearing, how they smelled, what music had been playing, the exact order of stabbings, where the knife went, what they said, what they didn't. He spoke with a stillness that was almost sacred, like he was reading scripture. The room went cold. Because he wasn't apologizing, he was remembering. And he remembered everything. Afterward, people said it felt like he'd been waiting to tell the story. Like the trial was just a stage. Like the murders weren't just violence, but art. And Danny, he thought he was the artist. He told the court he didn't act alone, that Gemini was the one behind it all. Gemini, he said, was the shadow in his chest, the voice that told him where to cut, the presence that wanted the blood displayed just right. Gemini didn't feel shame. Gemini demanded praise. But everyone in the courtroom knew the truth. Gemini wasn't real. Danny just didn't want to die. Alone. He started drawing behind bars, sketches of devils, women screaming, angels with missing eyes. He signed them all the same way, Rolling, Gemini. He mailed them to Sandra London, a crime writer who became his prison correspondent. She published his poetry, his letters. He talked about their love, even hinted at marriage for her. It was material. For him, it was legacy. Because Danny Rolling didn't want forgiveness. He wanted to be remembered. He wrote poems titled Mystery Rider and Make Room for Danny in them. He portrayed himself as a misunderstood prophet, a man shaped by pain, abandoned by God. He never once wrote the names of his victims, but he did mention Gemini 82 times. The prosecutors pushed for the death penalty. The defense tried insanity. The jury, they saw through all of it. Danny Rolling was sentenced to die, but he didn't fight it. He didn't appeal. He said he was ready. The Gainesville Ripper had written his ending. Now he just had to die on cue. October 25, 2006. The morning sky above Florida State Prison was a steel gray, heavy like it knew what was about to happen. There were no sirens, no crowds shouting justice or mercy, just a quiet hum of activity inside the walls. A man was scheduled to die that evening, a man who had stolen sleep from an entire generation. Danny Rolling had spent 16 years on death row. He never denied what he did, never asked for forgiveness, never showed an ounce of real remorse. He told interviewers he'd made peace with God, quoted scripture, scribbled psalms in the margins of his court documents, wrote poems about redemption. But he never mentioned their names. Not Sonia, not Christina, not Krista, not Manny, not Tracy. Not once. To him, they were pages in his performance, symbols in his mythology, evidence of a dark purpose he pretended was spiritual. But to the families, they weren't symbols. They were sons and daughters. They had birthdays, favorite songs, childhood fears, messy handwriting, favorite pizza toppings. They were real. Danny's execution was scheduled for 6 p.m. that morning. He ate his last meal, lobster tail, butterfly shrimp, a baked potato, strawberry cheesecake, sweet tea. He joked with the guards, hummed to himself, for hours. He wasn't nervous. He was rehearsing. At 5:55 p.m., he was led into the chamber, the straps wrapped over his chest and arms, like the final act of a play he had written himself. A crowd of 24 witnesses stood behind the glass, family members, attorneys, journalists, a few activists. Danny looked at them. And then he started to sing, a hymn. Soft at first, then louder. His voice cracked, but didn't stop. He sang until the injection hit his bloodstream, sang until the chemicals slowed his heart. He sang right into the silence, and then he was gone, declared dead at 6:13 p.m. just like that. The man who haunted Gainesville was now a body on a stretcher, but the story didn't end there. Because Danny Rolling got what he wanted. He was remembered. He became the blueprint for pop culture's new generation of evil. Books, podcasts, news specials, and of course, the movie, Scream, released in 1996, was loosely inspired by the Gainesville murders. Writers admitted it. The idea of a masked killer in a college town, striking randomly, slipping away without a trace, that wasn't fiction, that was Danny. The survivors hated it, because people forgot the names. They remembered the mask, the voice on the phone, the jump scare, but they didn't remember Tracy's smile, Krista's drawings, Manny's laugh, Christina's favorite sweater, Sonia's dreams of being a teacher. They remembered the killer. That was the real crime. But the families didn't stay quiet. Manny's brother started a foundation to support students who had lost siblings to violent crime. Krista's family set up a trauma support fund for law enforcement who worked the case. Tracy's mother became a lifelong advocate for women's safety in student housing. They turned horror into something louder than fear. But Gainesville, it never went back. The apartments were remodeled, students returned, but something stayed in the walls. You can still walk past the buildings where the murders happened. People still glance up at the third floor, still pause near the stairwells, not because they expect to see anything, but because they can't forget what they already saw. Every few years, new students move in. They laugh, they party, they live. But there's always a night late, quiet, when someone hears something they can't explain. A creak, a breath, a door that moves when no one touched it, and suddenly, they remember. Or they Google and they find it, the Gainesville Ripper. The story plays out in headlines, in documentaries, in YouTube videos. But in Gainesville, it plays out in memories. Because when a city bleeds, the stain never really disappears. It hides in corners, whispers in wind, lives in the back of your mind when you forget to lock the door. Danny Rolling is dead, but the echo, that stays. In every girl who triple checks her locks, in every roommate who wakes up to a sound and doesn't know if it was real, in every mother who sends her daughter off to college and says, "Call me when you get in." Because now, we know, monsters don't always wear masks. Sometimes, they wear a smile. Sometimes, they pitch a tent just outside your window. And sometimes, they wait.